June 5, 1944, Calais, France. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel stood in the fortified observation bunker overlooking the Pas-de-Calais coast, studying the grey waters of the English Channel through powerful binoculars. The weather was deteriorating. Storm clouds gathered over the horizon. Rain threatened. These conditions, he reasoned, would prevent any Allied invasion attempt. In Berlin, Hitler slept. At his headquarters in Berchtesgaden, he had given explicit orders that he was not to be disturbed except in circumstances of extreme emergency. No invasion was coming today. The meteorologists had assured him. The sea state was too rough. The winds are too strong. No rational military commander would attempt an amphibious landing in such conditions. Across the Channel, in Portsmouth and in dozens of embarkation ports along the southern English coast, 5,000 ships were moving into position. 136,000 soldiers had already boarded landing craft. 7,000 aircraft were being prepared for dawn operations. The largest invasion force ever assembled in military history was about to prove that rational military calculations mean nothing when facing overwhelming material commitment and ruthless operational necessity. But Rommel did not know this yet. None of the German commanders knew. What they knew was the Atlantic Wall. For 4 years they had built it, concrete bunkers bristling with guns, anti-tank obstacles covering beaches, minefields dense enough to kill in systematic patterns, barbed wire strung across dunes, flooded areas behind beaches to prevent inland movement, fortified villages transformed into strongpoints, the entire northern French coast transformed into a defensive position that, according to German military doctrine, should be capable of defeating any invasion attempt. They had studied invasion theory. They had examined history. They knew that amphibious operations were among the most difficult military maneuvers. A defending force, properly positioned and adequately armed, should possess overwhelming advantage. Theoretical calculations suggested that an amphibious assault required 3-to-1 numerical advantage at the landing site, or else the defending force could throw the invaders back into the sea. Germany did not have adequate forces available to defend every possible invasion location along the French coast, but they had substantial forces. Approximately 50,000 troops were stationed in Normandy, reinforcements available within striking distance, panzer reserves held back to counterattack wherever the main invasion developed. German commanders were confident that whatever the Allies attempted would fail. This confidence was not baseless. It was rooted in historical precedent, in military theory, in the demonstrated capability of German tactical units against Allied forces throughout the war. German forces had conducted successful amphibious operations at Norway in 1940. They had repulsed Allied invasion attempts at Dieppe in 1942, killing or capturing approximately 1,000 Canadian soldiers, while German losses remained minimal. They had experience defending difficult terrain. They had superior defensive positions. They had fortified locations. The mathematics seemed to favour Germany. What they did not possess was understanding of what industrial capacity could accomplish when directed toward a single military objective with absolute commitment and unlimited resources. If you are enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The story of the Atlantic Wall's collapse begins not on the beaches of Normandy on June 6th, but in German headquarters throughout May 1944, where intelligence officers and senior commanders were receiving increasingly alarming reports about Allied preparations. These were not just ordinary reports. They represented something historically unprecedented: the systematic documentation of an enemy preparing to execute the largest military operation in recorded history, with Allied intelligence deliberately allowing German reconnaissance to observe preparations they could not conceal at such scale. The German intelligence services had maintained extensive networks throughout occupied Europe and neutral territories. Agents operating in Switzerland, Sweden, and other neutral countries reported constantly on Allied activities. Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft, increasingly rare but still operational, flew photographic missions over southern England. Radio intercepts provided fragmentary but valuable intelligence. All these sources converged on the same conclusion: the Allies were preparing an invasion. The question was when and where. German Army High Command maintained two competing theories that reflected fundamental disagreements about where the main invasion would occur. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding all German forces in Western Europe, and his Chief of Staff, General Gunther Blumentritt, believed the main invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais. This location offered several tactical advantages for an invading force. It was the closest point to Britain. Supply lines would be shortest. Air coverage from fighter bases in southern England would be most concentrated. The terrain beyond the beaches favoured rapid manoeuvre towards strategic objectives. This assessment was reinforced by elaborate Allied deception operations collectively designated Operation Fortitude. Double agents working for British intelligence provided false information about invasion preparation. Phantom military units were created through dummy camps, inflatable tanks, false radio traffic. The Allies wanted German High Command to believe the invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding German armies in Normandy and responsible for operational defence along the coast, held a different assessment. He believed the main invasion would come in Normandy. This region offered less obvious tactical advantages. Beaches were less suitable for the massive supply operations that amphibious invasions required. The terrain inland was more difficult for rapid manoeuvre. But Rommel understood something about modern warfare that some other German commanders did not. Supply logistics determined operational capability. An amphibious invasion required enormous quantities of material flowing across open beaches. Normandy's geography, particularly the poor port facilities and limited beach capacity, should make it less attractive than Pas-de-Calais. Yet Rommel suspected this was precisely why the Allies might choose Normandy. They possessed such overwhelming superiority in shipping, landing craft, and supply capacity that they could overcome geographical disadvantages through brute force. They did not need the most efficient invasion location. They could succeed in difficult locations through sheer material commitment. This assessment was tactically sophisticated, but ultimately proved irrelevant. German command structure paralyzed decision-making. Orders went to Rundstedt. Rundstedt filtered them through his staff. Disagreement about invasion location meant that forces were divided between Normandy and Pas-de-Calais. Neither location received adequate reinforcement. German panzer reserves were held back, uncommitted, available for counterattack wherever the invasion actually developed. This policy made theoretical sense. It meant that whichever beach received the main invasion would face German tactical counterattack. But it also meant that no beach received adequate immediate reinforcement. German forces were dispersed and reactive rather than concentrated and prepared. The decision about where reserves could be committed had been placed in Hitler's hands through explicit orders that his personal permission was required before strategic reserves could be moved. Hitler, believing the invasion was still weeks away, had retired to Berchtesgaden on June 4th. He instructed his generals that he was not to be disturbed unless circumstances warranted emergency consultation. This delegation of authority to an absent commander who was not directly connected to rapidly developing tactical situations meant that German military response would be delayed by hours during hours when every minute determined outcomes. Throughout May, German intelligence received more reports about Allied invasion preparations. The volume of radio traffic originating from southern England increased dramatically. German direction-finding equipment plotted the locations of transmitters. Agents reported massive concentrations of military equipment and personnel in embarkation areas. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights, though increasingly dangerous due to Allied fighter interception, photographed assembly areas crowded with landing craft, trucks, ammunition dumps, supply stockpiles. The intelligence picture was clear. An invasion was imminent. But when? German meteorologists provided their forecast for early June. Severe storms were approaching. Rough seas would make landing operations extremely difficult. High winds would prevent air operations. The Allies would not attempt an invasion in such weather. This conclusion seemed reinforced by the experiences of previous amphibious operations. The raid on Dieppe in 1942 had been conducted in relatively calm conditions. Military tradition held that amphibious operations required favourable weather. Therefore, German commanders reasoned, the invasion would be delayed until weather improved. This reasoning demonstrated how military doctrine based on historical experience could become misleading when facing an opponent willing to accept risk and cost that previous operations had avoided. The Allies had spent years preparing this operation. They had enormous resources committed. The weather delay would have meant postponing the invasion for another lunar cycle, 2 additional weeks. The springtide conditions necessary for optimal landing conditions would not repeat until late June. 2 weeks of delay meant 2 weeks of additional German preparation, additional construction of defensive fortifications, additional time for German commanders to concentrate forces. The Allies decided to accept the risk of storm conditions and proceed. This decision, taken in the hours before the invasion, demonstrated willingness to tolerate costs that German commanders believed would be prohibitive. German forces on the coast did not receive last-minute orders to stand to higher alert. They were not told to expect the invasion at dawn on June 6th. The reports reaching German High Command in early June indicated an invasion was coming, but the precise timing and location remained uncertain. Most German commanders believed the invasion would not come until June 11th or later, when weather was forecast to improve. At dawn on June 6, 1944, approximately 7,000 Allied aircraft launched from British airfields. The opening bombardment began with precision bombing by heavy bombers targeting German airfields, supply depots, and communication installations. The effect was immediately devastating. German air defense was overwhelmed. Aircraft attempting to intercept were shot down by Allied fighters in overwhelming numbers. German radar installations detecting the approaching bomber streams received orders from command centers already disrupted by bombing. Communications between tactical units and higher headquarters were severed by the systematic destruction of telephone lines and radio relay stations. German anti-aircraft guns opened fire, but the sheer volume of aircraft made effective defense impossible. By the time the first landing craft touched down on Normandy beaches, German command and control systems were severely disrupted. The naval bombardment began at 05:30 hours, with battleships, cruisers, and destroyers moving into firing positions off the Normandy coast. 79 ships participated in the primary bombardment. They fired approximately 6,000 tons of ordnance in the opening phase, concentrating fire on identified German defensive positions. The accuracy was remarkable. Fortified positions that had been carefully constructed over months were demolished in hours. German soldiers sheltered in bunkers experienced the terror of having their fortifications systematically destroyed around them. The barrage continued for approximately 50 minutes, before lifting as landing craft began their final approach to the beaches. At 06:30 hours, the first waves of landing craft touched down on 5 beaches, designated Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. The beaches were defended by approximately 6,000 German troops. Behind them lay additional forces in prepared positions. German defenders opened fire as the landing craft discharged soldiers into the shallow water. The beaches became scenes of chaos and carnage. At Omaha Beach, the most heavily defended position and the site of the heaviest American casualties, the first assault waves suffered devastating losses. Approximately 2,000 American soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured in the first hours. The German defenders believed they were winning. They were stopping the invasion. The enemy was being thrown back, but the scale of the invasion became apparent as succeeding waves arrived. An entire assault division followed the first waves. Then additional divisions. Then follow-on divisions. The beach became crowded with tens of thousands of soldiers, with vehicles, with equipment, with supply stockpiles. More reinforcements arrived continuously throughout the day. By late afternoon, despite heavy casualties, the Americans had established a secure beachhead and were pushing inland. The British and Canadian landings on Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches, though facing less intense initial resistance than Omaha, still encountered determined German defense. But these too were overwhelmed by the sheer volume of arriving troops and equipment. By the evening of June 6th, 136,000 Allied troops had landed. Casualties totaled approximately 10,000, far fewer than German military theory suggested should have been necessary to defeat an amphibious landing. By June 7th, 300,000 troops were ashore. By June 10, 600,000. The invasion was not being repulsed. Instead, it was being reinforced and expanded at rates German forces could not match. The German counterattack, which was supposed to drive the invaders back into the sea, could not be organized. Forces were too dispersed. Communication systems were too disrupted. New formations arriving from other parts of France were harassed by Allied air power. The few panzer counterattacks that were organized arrived piecemeal, were intercepted by Allied air power, and suffered heavy losses. The critical moment came on June 7th, when German commanders requested permission to commit panzer reserves in a counterattack. This permission had to come from Hitler. Hitler was asleep at Berchtesgaden. His staff was reluctant to wake him. When the permission finally came, hours had passed. The panzer forces that could have been committed at dawn were not released until midday. By then, Allied troops had consolidated their beachheads. Additional troops continued arriving. The opportunity for a successful German counterattack had passed. Rommel, arriving back at his headquarters on June 6th evening after a visit to Berlin, immediately grasped the catastrophe unfolding. He told his staff that Germany had lost the war, not because German soldiers lacked courage or because German units were defeated in tactical engagements, but because the sheer scale of the Allied logistical commitment made German victory impossible. The Allies were landing equipment, ammunition, fuel, food, and replacement troops at rates that exceeded German production capacity for entire months. A single day of landing operations delivered more supplies to the beaches than German armies received through normal supply channels in extended periods. The follow-on logistics established the true nature of the challenge facing German defenders. Artificial harbours designated mulberries, temporary harbours built in Britain and towed across the Channel, were assembled off the Normandy coast. Each harbour was roughly the size of Dover, Britain's major port. They allowed the Allies to discharge massive quantities of equipment directly onto the beaches rather than having to capture existing port facilities. Within days, the Mulberry harbours were handling thousands of tons of supplies daily. Within weeks, they were handling tens of thousands of tons daily. German forces could not match this logistical capability. They could not supply their armies being pushed back inland with the same reliability. They could not accumulate supplies for counterattacks. They could not maintain equipment in combat condition when replacement parts arrived slowly and ammunition reserves depleted faster than they could be replenished. The invasion succeeded not because individual German soldiers fought less effectively than individual Allied soldiers. The invasion succeeded because the Allies possessed industrial capacity to supply invading armies at scales German industry could not replicate or counter. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The mathematical analysis that German intelligence officers should have conducted becomes clear when examining the logistical realities of the Normandy operation. The first day of the invasion delivered 136,000 troops, approximately 13,000 vehicles, and approximately 5,000 tons of supplies to the beaches. The second day brought approximately 80,000 additional troops, 7,000 vehicles, and 4,000 tons of supplies. Every subsequent day brought reinforcements at rates that averaged approximately 100,000 troops, 10,000 vehicles, and 10,000 tons of supplies. By June 30, 1 million troops were ashore, 350,000 vehicles had landed, and approximately 600,000 tons of supplies had been delivered. By August, when the breakout from Normandy began, 2 million troops were ashore with approximately 750,000 vehicles, and over 10 million tons of supplies accumulated in depots behind the invasion beaches. German forces facing this invasion never possessed the capability to match this logistical commitment. The entire German war economy in 1944 was producing approximately 120,000 trucks annually. The Allies landed more vehicles in Normandy in August than Germany produced in an entire year. German ammunition production in 1944 was approximately 240,000 tons monthly. The Allies delivered more ammunition in 3 weeks in Normandy than Germany produced in a month. German fuel production through synthetic processes and Romanian imports totaled approximately 3 to 4 million tons annually. The Allies delivered enough fuel to the Normandy beachhead in the first month to support all their operational forces. The strategic implications were lost on no one in German command. Rommel's assessment that Germany had lost the war proved accurate. What had been a theoretical possibility in intelligence reports from May now became a brutal reality. The Allies possessed industrial capacity to land invasion forces on hostile territory and sustain them in combat indefinitely. Germany could resist. Germany could fight skillfully. Germany could extract heavy casualties. But Germany could not prevail because the fundamental equation of modern warfare had shifted decisively against them. The mathematics of the Normandy landing illustrated principles that intelligence officers had documented in captured American supply documents 1 year earlier. If one American corps could receive 3.2 million gallons of fuel monthly, then entire invasion armies could be sustained on similar scales. If American factories could produce hundreds of thousands of trucks annually, then massive vehicle fleets could be available for amphibious operations. If American shipyards could produce Liberty ships at rates exceeding German submarine sinking capacity, then transporting invasion forces and their supplies across the Atlantic was logistically feasible, despite German naval opposition. The Normandy invasion was not a tactical surprise that caught German forces unprepared. German commanders had anticipated an invasion for months. The tactical surprise was limited to specific timing and location. The true shock was not tactical but strategic. German defensive doctrine was predicated on the assumption that defending forces would possess advantages sufficient to repel amphibious invasion attempts. This assumption was correct when defending and attacking forces possessed comparable material resources. But when the attacking force possessed overwhelming material superiority, defensive advantages became irrelevant. A fortified position defended by 1,000 well-armed soldiers could hold against an attacking force of 5,000 soldiers with limited assault equipment, but a fortified position defended by 1,000 soldiers could not hold against an attacking force of 50,000 soldiers with massive air support, naval bombardment, and continuous reinforcement. The equation changed when quantities increased by orders of magnitude. The Atlantic Wall was not impenetrable. It was merely insufficient against the scale of commitment the Allies could bring to bear. German forces inflicted heavy casualties on the Allies. The fighting at Omaha Beach demonstrated that prepared positions with determined defenders could still cause massive casualties even against overwhelming numbers. Approximately 2,000 American soldiers died on that single beach on that single day. German defenders took comfort in these casualties. It proved that German soldiers could still fight effectively, but casualty counts became strategically irrelevant when the attacking force could replace losses and continue operations. American divisions that suffered heavy casualties in June received replacement troops in July and continued combat operations. German divisions that suffered heavy casualties could not be reinforced. Replacement troops were diverted to other threatened sectors. Losses became permanent attrition rather than temporary setbacks. Within weeks of the landing, German forces in Normandy were losing more men daily than they could replace. Within months, German armies were being pushed back steadily as Allied numerical superiority increased rather than decreased. The breakout from Normandy began in late July when American forces captured Saint-Lô. German attempts to contain the American advance failed. The encirclement of German forces in the Falaise pocket in mid-August demonstrated how overwhelming logistical support enabled strategic maneuver. American forces circled around German armies, cutting supply lines, trapping massive forces in defensive positions with decreasing ammunition, fuel, and food. Approximately 50,000 German soldiers were captured. Approximately 10,000 were killed. Equipment losses were devastating. German forces in France sustained over 100,000 casualties in August alone. These were irreplaceable losses from diminishing reserves. The August casualty figures represented approximately 20% of German manpower in France. For a nation already stretched across multiple fronts, sustaining such losses meant that subsequent German operations would be conducted with reduced strength. Replacements came slowly. Training was minimal. The professional officer corps was being decimated. Within weeks of the Normandy breakout, German strength in France had been reduced to a fraction of pre-invasion levels. The invasion succeeded because of overwhelming logistical commitment, allied with air superiority that prevented German reinforcement and resupply. It succeeded because German defensive doctrine, based on historical experience from previous wars, assumed that defending forces would possess sufficient advantages to repel invasion attempts. It succeeded because German strategic planning, constrained by limited resources and divided commitments across multiple fronts, could not concentrate sufficient force in a single location to overwhelm an attacking force supported by unlimited industrial capacity. Most fundamentally, the Normandy invasion succeeded because one nation possessed the capability to transport and sustain a multi-million-man army in sustained combat across vast distances, while another nation could barely supply the forces already at hand. The captured intelligence documents that German analysts had studied in 1943 predicted this outcome with mathematical precision. American production of trucks would enable logistical operations on unprecedented scales. American ammunition production would support artillery at rates German forces could not match. American fuel production would sustain mechanized operations indefinitely. American shipbuilding would transport invasion forces across oceans. American industrial capacity would manufacture replacement equipment and vehicles faster than combat losses could destroy them. The mathematics were undeniable. What the German command failed to do was accept the implications of these mathematics and plan accordingly. Instead, they believed that tactical skill, defensive fortifications, and German military superiority would overcome material disadvantage. They were wrong. The Normandy invasion exposed this miscalculation with brutal clarity. German defenders fought skillfully. German fortifications were formidable. German weapons were often superior to their Allied counterparts. But all these tactical advantages meant nothing against the scale of logistical commitment the Allies could bring to bear. German panzer divisions, equipped with Tigers and Panthers, were formidable combat units that could defeat Allied tanks in direct engagement. But German panzer divisions in Normandy were continuously harassed by Allied air power, preventing daylight movement, were attacked by anti-tank guns and infantry in overwhelming numbers, lost experienced commanders and crews faster than they could be replaced, and eventually were destroyed through attrition by the simple equation that German tanks were outnumbered by factors of 5-to-1 or greater in the operational area. Quality meant nothing against quantity on such scales. The story of the Atlantic Wall's collapse reveals a deeper truth about modern industrial warfare. Fortifications matter, defensive positions matter, training matters, equipment quality matters, but all these factors become secondary when facing an opponent with overwhelming material superiority. The Allies did not win at Normandy through superior tactics or better trained troops. The Americans and British soldiers fought effectively and bravely. German soldiers fought with courage and skill. The difference was not in individual unit performance, but in the aggregate of resources available. For every German reinforcement that arrived to strengthen a defensive position, 3 Allied reinforcements arrived to strengthen the attacking force. For every tank the Germans lost, the Allies could replace it within days. German tanks required months to replace. For every German soldier killed or wounded, replacement came slowly and with minimal training. Allied casualties were replaced within weeks with trained replacements. The asymmetry was overwhelming and decisive. The intelligence organizations that had predicted this outcome 1 year earlier, through careful analysis of captured American supply documents and production statistics, had been accurate in every fundamental aspect. They had identified the key variable. Industrial capacity determines the outcome of modern warfare between industrial nations. They had calculated the magnitude of the imbalance. American production exceeded German capacity by factors of 3-to-1 or greater across every category of military equipment. They had projected the implications. Germany could not sustain indefinite warfare against such imbalance. But these accurate assessments had been dismissed by German leadership as defeatism. Commanders who presented them were accused of undermining morale. Political leaders rejected them as propaganda. The reality that intelligence officers had documented through careful analysis was dismissed as unacceptable because accepting it meant accepting inevitable defeat. The Normandy invasion proved that intelligence assessment had been correct and leadership's rejection of reality had been catastrophic. German forces in France fought a losing campaign from the moment the first landing craft touched down on June 6. They did not know this that morning. They believed they could repel the invasion. But senior commanders like Rommel, who understood industrial warfare mathematics, knew the truth. Germany had lost at the moment the Allies committed the resources necessary to execute the Normandy landing. The shooting might continue, the fighting might last months, but the outcome was predetermined by the industrial capacity each side could bring to bear. The speed with which the German position in France collapsed demonstrates how overwhelming logistical superiority translates into operational capability. By August, after less than 3 months of fighting, German forces had suffered over 400,000 casualties. Most of the military equipment present in France on June 5 had been destroyed or captured. German air forces had largely withdrawn from the theatre, unable to compete with Allied air superiority. German naval forces had been eliminated completely. German forces in France were in disintegration. The reinforcements arriving from other theatres were inadequate to restore German capability. Formations extracted from Italy, from Eastern Europe, from Germany itself arrived piecemeal to replace catastrophic losses, but they could not arrive fast enough or in sufficient quantities to restore German strength. The mathematical equation was irreversible. American and British forces continued pouring across the Channel. French forces liberated Paris in late August and pushed toward Germany. Soviet forces advanced from the east. German defences were collapsing on all fronts simultaneously. The tragedy of the Normandy campaign for German participants was that it demonstrated what accurate intelligence assessment and realistic strategic planning might have accomplished. If German leadership had accepted the intelligence conclusions documented in 1943 about Allied industrial capacity, they might have arranged a negotiated settlement before losing France, before losing German territory to Soviet invasion, before the complete destruction that followed. Instead, they rejected mathematical reality, insisting that ideology, willpower, and tactical skill would overcome material disadvantage. The cost of this rejection was measured in hundreds of thousands of additional casualties: the destruction of German cities by strategic bombing, the Soviet conquest of Eastern Europe, the division of Germany itself. The Normandy invasion was the strategic turning point that made complete German defeat inevitable. But the mathematics making defeat inevitable had existed 1 year earlier in captured American supply documents studied in German intelligence offices. The German commanders who understood this mathematics, like Rommel and Guderian, recognized that military operations were becoming irrelevant. The war would be determined not by battles but by production statistics. The nation that could produce more weapons, transport more supplies, and sustain more casualties would win regardless of tactical performance. German commanders could still influence how long the war would last, how many casualties would be inflicted, whether German territory would be invaded, but they could not influence the ultimate outcome. The examination of this historical episode reveals the decisive role of logistics and industrial capacity in modern warfare. The Normandy invasion succeeded not because the Allies were better led or better trained. Success came because the Allies possessed the industrial capacity to build 5,000 ships, train and equip 500,000 soldiers, produce millions of tons of supplies, and sustain all of this in continuous combat operations across months of fighting. Germany simply could not match this commitment because Germany did not possess the industrial capacity. The Atlantic Wall failed not because the fortifications were poorly constructed, failed because fortifications mean nothing against invasion forces supported by unlimited supplies, unlimited reinforcements, and overwhelming air power. Rommel had understood this. He knew that the only way to defeat an invasion was to defeat it at the beach during the initial landing, before the attackers could consolidate their beachhead and begin receiving massive reinforcements. The hedgehog obstacles and anti-tank guns and machine gun positions were designed to inflict such heavy casualties during the landing that the invaders would withdraw. But the casualties inflicted, though severe, were insufficient to deter an invasion force backed by industrial capacity adequate to sustain even heavy losses and continue operations. The mathematics were unforgiving. 2,000 American casualties at Omaha Beach represented a devastating tactical setback, but it was tactically irrelevant because 150,000 American soldiers remained ashore and additional soldiers were arriving continuously. German forces in Normandy never possessed sufficient strength to inflict casualties at rates that would have forced American withdrawal. American commanders had calculated the acceptable casualty rate in advance. They had decided that up to 100,000 casualties would be acceptable costs for establishing a secure beachhead. If German forces could have inflicted 100,000 casualties, they would have ended the invasion. But German forces could not inflict casualties at that rate with the troops available. The asymmetry was structural and mathematical, rather than tactical or operational. The story of the Atlantic Wall and the Normandy invasion transcends the specific military details. It illustrates how overwhelming material superiority in modern warfare can overcome defensive advantages, fortified positions, and tactical skill of defending forces. It demonstrates how industrial capacity determines the outcome of wars between industrial nations. It shows how accurate intelligence analysis becomes meaningless when leadership refuses to accept unwelcome conclusions based on that analysis. Most profoundly, it illustrates how the scale of commitment determines outcomes more than the quality of commitment. A better trained soldier faces an enemy with 5 times as many soldiers. The mathematics are inexorable. The individual soldier's superior training becomes irrelevant when facing such overwhelming numbers backed by unlimited supplies. The Normandy invasion succeeded because the Allies could afford to absorb heavy casualties and continue fighting. Germany could not afford to absorb the casualties necessary to repel the invasion. The examination of German intelligence reports from 1943 and their rejection by leadership reveals the tragic paradox of command failure. Accurate information becomes worthless if leadership refuses to accept its implications. Professional analysis means nothing if decisions are based on ideology rather than evidence. The intelligence officers who had studied American supply documents 1 year before Normandy had provided accurate warning of what the invasion would look like and what it would mean for German military prospects. They had calculated that American industrial capacity was adequate to supply invasion armies indefinitely. They had identified that German forces could not match this logistical commitment. They had warned that the mathematical outcome was predetermined by the industrial balance. Their analysis had been thorough, accurate, and professionally presented. Their conclusions had been rejected because they were unacceptable politically. German leadership chose to believe in willpower and defensive superiority rather than in mathematics and industrial capacity. The Normandy campaign that began on June 6, 1944, was decided before the first shot was fired. It was decided in captured American supply documents analyzed 1 year earlier. It was decided in American factories producing hundreds of thousands of trucks and millions of tons of supplies. It was decided in American shipyards, launching Liberty ships at rates exceeding German submarine sinking capacity. It was decided in American training programs producing and deploying replacement soldiers and equipment faster than combat losses could destroy them. It was decided in the fundamental industrial balance that made German victory mathematically impossible. The Atlantic Wall was impenetrable only against invasion forces with comparable material resources. Against invasion forces backed by overwhelming industrial capacity, no fortification could be impenetrable. The most heavily fortified position becomes vulnerable when attackers arrive with 5 times as many soldiers, unlimited ammunition, continuous air support, and endless supplies. The mathematics are unforgiving. Fortifications cannot overcome such asymmetry. Experience at Normandy proved this beyond question. German forces inflicted heavy casualties and fought skillfully and bravely, but bravery and skill could not overcome the industrial advantage that the Allies possessed. By late August, German forces in France had been destroyed as a coherent military force. Over 400,000 casualties, massive equipment losses, complete air superiority to the Allies, naval forces eliminated. The only question remaining was how long German forces on other fronts could continue fighting before the accumulated effect of losses on all fronts made continued resistance impossible. The Normandy invasion and the subsequent campaign in France demonstrated that the intelligence assessments made 1 year earlier were accurate in every fundamental aspect. American industrial capacity had proven decisive. German tactical skill had proven irrelevant against overwhelming material superiority. The mathematical certainty of German defeat, documented in supply manifests and production statistics, had been confirmed on the fields of France through the triumph of logistics over fortifications, through the victory of industrial capacity over defensive positions, through the mathematics of attrition that favored the side with unlimited supplies and unlimited ability to replace casualties. The officers and soldiers who had defended the Atlantic Wall had fought bravely and skillfully. Their failure was not a failure of courage or tactical ability. Their failure was the failure of a nation lacking sufficient industrial capacity to sustain indefinite warfare against an opponent with 3 to 5 times its productive capability. The Atlantic Wall was not impenetrable. It was merely insufficient, and no amount of courage or tactical skill could compensate for that fundamental material deficit. The invasion succeeded because industrial capacity transformed it from theoretical possibility into operational reality. The Normandy campaign illustrated one final time the decisive principle that had driven German defeat throughout the war. Whoever possesses the industrial capacity to produce more weapons, supplies, and replacement personnel will ultimately prevail in wars of industrial attrition. Germany had lost that competition before the Normandy invasion began. The invasion simply demonstrated visibly what intelligence officers had documented 1 year earlier. Industrial capacity determines the outcome of modern warfare. Germany possessed it insufficiently. The Allies possessed it overwhelmingly. The mathematical result was inevitable. The weeks following the Normandy landing became a race against time and mathematics. German commanders understood that every day without a successful counterattack meant their situation deteriorated further. Every reinforcement that arrived from Germany took days to reach the front. Every reinforcement the Allies received arrived within hours. The asymmetry accelerated daily. By June 10th, the first German counterattack was attempted in Normandy. Panzergruppe West, commanded by General Hasso von Manteuffel, attempted to drive a wedge between the American and British beachheads. The attack was organized hastily because the panzer reserves had been committed piecemeal rather than concentrated. German tanks were formidable weapons. The Panther represented a significant improvement over earlier German designs. The Tiger was feared by Allied tankers with good reason, but the fundamental problem remained. German panzer divisions in Normandy numbered perhaps 300 tanks total across multiple divisions. American forces in Normandy by June 10th included approximately 1,000 tanks, with additional tanks arriving daily. The exchange ratio was unsustainable for Germany. German commanders could win tactical victories. Individual German tanks could defeat multiple Allied tanks through superior gunnery and armor, but individual German tanks could not defeat 10 Allied tanks. The mathematics were implacable. A German division with 30 tanks facing an American division with 100 tanks faced mathematical certainty of destruction regardless of tactical superiority. Rommel understood this with perfect clarity. He attempted multiple times to convince Hitler that the war was lost and that negotiations were Germany's only option. Each request was rejected. Hitler insisted that new wonder weapons would arrive: jet aircraft, improved submarines, V-weapons that would rain destruction on Britain and force their surrender. These weapons existed. Some were under development, but they would arrive too late. The timeline did not permit. By the time the first Me-262 jet fighters became operationally available in late summer 1944, the Allies already possessed complete air superiority over Normandy. The few jet aircraft Germany could produce were outnumbered by tens of thousands of Allied conventional fighters. Quality advantage meant nothing. The mathematics was overwhelming. Rommel's requests for realistic assessment of the situation were met with accusations of defeatism. His attempts to conduct limited withdrawals to more defensible positions were countermanded by Hitler, who insisted that every inch of French territory be held to the last man. The strategic consequence was that German forces in Normandy were forced to defend indefensible positions with dwindling resources while being continuously attacked by overwhelming numbers. By late July, German forces had suffered over 150,000 casualties. The reinforcements arriving were insufficient to replace these losses. More critically, the experienced soldiers and officers who had survived earlier campaigns were being killed at unsustainable rates. Young replacement troops arrived with minimal training, commanded by junior officers fresh from training programs. These replacements could not match the tactical skill of the professionals they replaced. Cumulative losses meant that German tactical capability declined week by week, despite occasional tactical successes. The capture of Saint-Lô on July 18th opened the possibility of American breakout from Normandy. The bocage terrain of Normandy, with its dense hedgerows and enclosed fields, had favoured defence. German forces adapted to this terrain relatively well, but beyond Saint-Lô, the terrain opened. Traditional defensive tactics became less effective. American forces could manoeuvre, American armour could advance. The breakout operations beginning in late July revealed the full extent of Allied capability. Operation Cobra, the American breakout offensive, launched on July 25th with massive air bombardment. Over 2,000 medium bombers targeted German defensive positions. The bombing was devastating but not perfectly accurate. American bombers killed approximately 120 American soldiers through accidental bombing. The impact on German forces was catastrophic. Fortified positions were pulverized. German defenders emerged from their bunkers dazed and disorganized. American infantry advanced steadily. German counterattacks were hastily organized and piecemeal, lacking coordination or concentration of force. Within days, the American breakout had secured significant territory. By early August, American forces had broken through German defensive lines entirely. The strategic opportunity had arrived. American armour could advance into open territory. German reserves could not be concentrated fast enough to stop the breakthrough. Reinforcements from other sectors were being extracted, but they arrived slowly and were immediately committed to contain the advancing Americans. The mathematics of reinforcement favoured the Allies overwhelmingly. For every German tank that arrived to reinforce the front line, 3 American tanks arrived. For every German battalion that reinforced a threatened sector, an entire American division reinforced the opposite sector. German commanders were playing tactical chess while the Allies were playing strategic mathematics. They were outmaneuvered not through superior Allied tactics, but through superior Allied resources. By August 12th, American forces had advanced to Alençon. The opportunity existed to encircle vast German forces. If American forces could push northward from Alençon, while Canadian forces advanced southward from the British beachhead, German armies in Normandy would be trapped in a gigantic encirclement. The Falaise pocket would become the tomb of German military power in France. German commanders recognized the threat and attempted to contain the American breakthrough, but containment required forces that did not exist. Every reserve was committed, every formation was stretched thin. The Germans attempted a desperate counter-offensive. On August 7th, Hitler ordered a panzer attack toward Mortagne, attempting to restore a connected defensive line and prevent further American advances. The attack was mounted with the forces available rather than the forces necessary for success. Approximately 300 panzers attacked across a relatively narrow front. American forces, warned by ultra-intelligence intercepts of the impending attack, prepared defensive positions. When the panzers attacked, they drove forward initially, pushing through American defensive lines. But they could not break through completely. American reinforcements arrived. Airstrikes were called down on the attacking panzers. Tank destroyers and anti-tank guns engaged the German armour. The panzer attack was stopped and then thrown back. German forces suffered heavy losses in the Mortagne counteroffensive. Approximately 150 tanks were destroyed or captured. This represented perhaps half of German panzer strength in Normandy. Casualties were severe. Experienced commanders fell. The offensive revealed that German forces lacked sufficient strength to mount large-scale operations. But more importantly, The Mortain offensive demonstrated how the mathematics of attrition had shifted decisively. German forces attacked with approximately 20% of Allied tank strength in the operational area. The attack was repulsed, and German forces were pushed backward. American forces did not counterattack with overwhelming advantage. They defended, absorbed the German assault, and maintained their positions. They did not need dramatic counterattacks. They only needed to maintain their numerical superiority and continue receiving reinforcements. Eventually, the mathematics of attrition would destroy German capability entirely. The Falaise encirclement became inevitable after the Mortain counteroffensive failed. American forces, having contained the German offensive, resumed their advance. The Canadian First Army advanced from the north. The trap closed. Approximately 50,000 German troops were surrounded. German forces attempted to break out. Some succeeded in escaping through the gap that was narrowing progressively. Thousands were captured, thousands were killed. The equipment losses were staggering. Tank parks were abandoned, supply depots were destroyed or captured, artillery batteries were overrun, trucks and vehicles by the thousands were abandoned or destroyed. The Germans lost more tanks in the Falaise pocket than they had produced in months. The casualties in the pocket represented approximately 100,000 German soldiers, killed, wounded, or captured. When the encirclement was closed on August 21st, German military power in France had ceased to exist as a coherent force. The surviving German formations were fragmented, exhausted, demoralized. The intelligence assessments of German defeat were proven accurate beyond any doubt. The analysis conducted 1 year earlier on captured American supply documents had predicted exactly what would occur. American industrial capacity would enable invasion forces to be supplied indefinitely. German forces would be unable to match this logistical commitment. The mathematical outcome would be German destruction through attrition. Every prediction had come true. Field Marshal Rommel, who had accurately assessed the strategic situation and repeatedly warned that Germany was losing the war, was removed from command on July 18th after being wounded in an air attack. He was replaced by Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, who attempted to salvage the situation through tactical maneuver. Von Kluge recognized that the strategic situation was hopeless, but believed that disciplined withdrawal to more defensible positions might extend German resistance. Hitler rejected any suggestion of withdrawal. Hitler demanded that captured territory be retaken. Hitler insisted that German counteroffensives would restore the situation. Hitler's orders became increasingly disconnected from operational reality. German commanders received orders to defend positions that could not be defended with available forces, to mount offensives that could not succeed with available resources, to resist in situations where continued resistance could only increase casualties without changing the outcome. The weeks following Falaise became a relentless German retreat. German forces withdrew eastward toward the Seine River. German forces withdrew eastward toward the Rhine. German forces withdrew toward Germany itself. Every kilometer of withdrawal represented another strategic defeat, another confirmation that the industrial mathematics documented 1 year earlier had been accurate. By September, German forces had evacuated France entirely. The liberation of Paris occurred on August 25th, the complete German collapse in France by mid-September. In less than 100 days, the Allies had landed 1 million troops, established a secure beachhead, conducted breakout operations, surrounded and destroyed German armies in the Falaise pocket, liberated Paris, and driven German forces back across France toward Germany. This extraordinary achievement was not the result of tactical superiority alone. It was the result of the logistical capability to sustain such operations indefinitely. German forces could not retreat, regroup, and counterattack effectively because they lacked the supplies to mount large-scale offensives. Every attempted counterattack consumed fuel, ammunition, and equipment that could not be replaced quickly. Every retreat meant abandoning supplies accumulated in depots. Every withdrawal meant longer supply lines that could not be adequately protected from Allied air attack. German logistics deteriorated with every kilometer of retreat. Allied logistics improved with every kilometer of advance. Supply lines from Normandy beaches extended progressively eastward. The Mulberry harbours transferred their loads to captured French ports as the Allies advanced. Rail lines were repaired and brought into operation. Supply dumps were established progressively deeper into liberated France. By late August, the Allies had established supply capabilities that exceeded their operational requirements. They were receiving more supplies than they could consume. Ammunition dumps contained more rounds than artillery units could fire in extended periods. Fuel depots held reserves exceeding immediate needs. Food supplies accumulated faster than troops could eat them. The abundance was startling compared to the scarcity that characterized German logistics. German armies were retreating into a supply crisis of their own creation. As they withdrew from France, they abandoned supply installations. The supplies they abandoned were captured by pursuing Allied forces. Every German retreat meant that pursuing Allied forces acquired captured supplies that extended their logistical reach. More supply was available to continue the advance. Mathematics created a vicious cycle for Germany. Retreat meant abandoned supplies. Abandoned supplies meant advancing. Allies were provided with additional logistics. Additional logistics meant the Allies could continue pursuing and forcing further German retreat. German forces could not establish a stable defensive position because they lacked the supplies to sustain defensive operations in fixed positions. Defensive lines require continuous supply. They require ammunition for sustained artillery bombardment. They require fuel for mobile counterattacks. They require food and medical supplies for the troops holding the line. German forces did not have these supplies in the quantities required. They could hold positions for limited periods. Then they had to retreat to avoid being cut off or surrounded. Field Marshal von Kluge, recognizing the impossibility of the situation and the consequences of continued adherence to Hitler's unrealistic orders, attempted suicide on September 19. He was prevented from succeeding and was recalled to Germany. He was suspected of connections to the July 20th plot against Hitler. He was stripped of command and faced interrogation and likely execution. The crisis of leadership in German command extended beyond the military realm. The High Command was demoralized. Senior commanders recognized that defeat was inevitable, but continued fighting because they had no authority to end the war. The catastrophe in France demonstrated conclusively that the intelligence assessment from 1 year earlier had been absolutely accurate. German forces had been destroyed not through any failure of courage or tactical skill, but through the mathematics of industrial warfare. Germany could not produce the quantities of equipment required to sustain warfare against an opponent with 3 to 5 times its industrial capacity. The invasion succeeded not because German defences were poorly constructed or poorly manned. The invasion succeeded because the invaders possessed overwhelming logistical support that made German defence mathematically insufficient. By September 1944, German High Command faced the reality that had been predicted 1 year earlier in captured American supply documents. Germany was fighting a war that it was mathematically certain to lose. The only questions remaining were how long the war would continue, how many additional casualties would occur, and whether any negotiated settlement remained possible. Hitler's response to the catastrophe in France was to demand continued resistance and the preparation of new offensives. The Ardennes offensive in December 1944 represented Hitler's final attempt to change the strategic situation through military means. The operation depended on capturing American fuel supplies because German logistics could not sustain an offensive of that scale. The planning explicitly acknowledged that Germany could not supply large-scale military operations through normal logistics. The army would have to survive by seizing enemy supplies. This admission revealed how completely German military capability had been eroded through industrial attrition. German armies could no longer conduct sustained operations with their own resources. They could only conduct operations by living off captured enemy supplies. This was warfare of desperation, conducted by a nation whose industrial capacity had been overwhelmed. The Ardennes offensive was stopped by American forces and thrown back in chaos. German forces suffered approximately 190,000 casualties. German armor losses were approximately 1,400 tanks. This represented German tank production for multiple months. The casualties represented irreplaceable losses from dwindling manpower reserves. Germany had no strategic reserves remaining. Every formation that suffered heavy casualties had to be withdrawn from the line to reconstitute. Replacement troops were not available in sufficient quantities. Tank production was being disrupted by Allied bombing and raw material shortages. The industrial capacity to sustain German military operations was failing progressively. By early 1945, German military forces were no longer capable of mounting large-scale operations. They could conduct tactical defense, they could inflict casualties, but they lacked the equipment, supplies, ammunition, and fuel necessary for offensive operations on significant scales. The attrition that German intelligence officers had predicted would destroy German military capability had been accurately calculated. Germany had been able to sustain military operations for 1 year after the intelligence assessment concluded that victory was impossible. But the continued losses meant that German capability declined progressively. By spring 1945, German forces on the Western Front were incapable of conducting organized defense. They lacked fuel for tactical mobility. They lacked ammunition for sustained defense. They lacked air support because the Luftwaffe had been destroyed through attrition and fuel shortages. They lacked armor because German tank production had been overwhelmed by battlefield losses. German soldiers fought with courage and determination, but with equipment that was increasingly inadequate and supplies that were increasingly insufficient. The final collapse of German forces in the West occurred in April 1945, when American and British forces advanced into Germany itself. German soldiers surrendered en masse because continued resistance was impossible and pointless. The war in Europe ended on May 7, 1945, with German, unconditional surrender. The military officers and soldiers who had survived the Normandy campaign through the final collapse had experienced the full consequences of industrial warfare between nations with profoundly asymmetrical production capacity. They had witnessed the collapse of the Atlantic Wall. They had endured the encirclement at Falaise. They had retreated across France, Belgium, and the Rhine. They had fought in defensive positions with dwindling supplies and dwindling prospects. They had participated in desperate offensives that consumed irreplaceable resources for no strategic gain. They had ended the war as prisoners of the Allies or as soldiers of a nation that had surrendered unconditionally. The tragedy of the Normandy campaign was that it was entirely predictable. The intelligence officers who had studied American supply documents 1 year earlier had understood exactly what would occur. They had calculated the scale of American production and the scale of German production. They had identified the ratio. They had projected that this ratio would make German victory impossible. They had documented their conclusions in classified reports. These reports had been presented to German leadership, who rejected them as defeatism. The rejection of accurate intelligence assessment based on documented evidence represented one of the great failures of command in military history. The consequence was 100,000 casualties at Falaise alone, hundreds of thousands of additional casualties in France through months of fighting that changed nothing, millions of additional casualties in other theatres through continued warfare when victory was mathematically impossible, the destruction of German cities, the Soviet conquest of Eastern Europe, the division of Germany. All the catastrophe that followed could potentially have been avoided or limited through realistic acceptance of the industrial mathematics that determined the war's outcome. The story of the Normandy invasion and the Atlantic Wall's collapse contains a lesson that extends far beyond World War II. It demonstrates that fortifications, training, equipment quality, and tactical skill all matter less than industrial capacity when military forces possess such profound asymmetry. A well-designed fortification garrisoned by well-trained troops facing an invading force with 10 times the industrial support will fall to attrition. A tactical advantage in a single engagement becomes irrelevant when facing an enemy with 3-to-1 numerical superiority. Courage and skill still matter. They determine casualty rates and the length of time defense can be sustained. But they do not determine ultimate outcomes when facing overwhelming material commitment. The Normandy campaign proved this principle with brutal clarity. German defenders killed or wounded over 100,000 Allied soldiers. German forces achieved numerous tactical victories and inflicted severe casualties. German soldiers demonstrated bravery and tactical skill, but all of this accomplished nothing in strategic terms because the Allies possessed such overwhelming industrial support that they could absorb these casualties and continue operations without pause. The intelligence officers who had predicted this outcome understood a truth that military leadership struggled to accept. Industrial capacity determines the outcome of wars between modern industrial nations. Courage, skill, leadership, tactics, all matter within the constraints set by industrial capacity. But when industrial capacity is asymmetrically distributed, these other factors become secondary. Germany could not win at Normandy because Germany lacked the industrial capacity to supply invasion defense that could resist American industrial commitment. The examination of captured American supply documents had revealed this mathematics. The subsequent military operations confirmed it with undeniable clarity. The Atlantic Wall was not impenetrable. No fortification is impenetrable against invasion forces backed by overwhelming industrial capacity. The wall was merely a speed bump in the path of an American military machine supplied with the resources of an entire nation's industrial capacity. The wall was overrun, circumvented, penetrated, and rendered strategically irrelevant by the industrial machinery that sustained the invasion operation. The final accounting of World War II confirms the intelligence assessments made 1 year before Normandy. Germany lost the war not in any single battle, but through the accumulated mathematics of industrial attrition. The Normandy invasion was the operational expression of the industrial superiority that intelligence officers had documented. The invasion succeeded because American factories could produce more weapons, vehicles, and supplies than German factories. The invasion succeeded because American shipyards could transport invasion forces across oceans. The invasion succeeded because American agricultural production could feed invasion armies. The invasion succeeded because every element of American industrial capacity was directed toward the single objective of defeating Germany. Germany could not match this commitment because Germany lacked the industrial base to do so. The mathematics were written before the first shot was fired. The intelligence officers had read the mathematics and tried to warn their leadership. Their leadership had rejected the warning. The consequence was that the inevitable defeat unfolded across years of additional warfare, with millions of additional casualties. The story of the Normandy invasion is fundamentally the story of industrial capacity translating into military capability. It is the story of mathematics determining outcomes more certainly than courage or skill. It is the story of accurate intelligence being rejected by leadership unwilling to accept unpleasant truth. It is the story of the Atlantic Wall, representing German will and capability confronting American industrial might and logistical capacity. The wall represented the best that German military engineering could construct. The invasion represented the best that American industrial capacity could commit. The collision between German defensive will and American industrial logistics determined the outcome. Industrial logistics won. The mathematics were irrefutable. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and do not forget to subscribe.